in your study, you broke down several different types of rhetoric or messaging that you presented to survey respondents. And one of the styles in particular that you guys focus on is woke messaging, very scientific term. I was hoping you could maybe break down a little bit what you mean by woke messaging, and then how did voters respond to that type of messaging?
Right. So in many surveys, you will basically have very, very, very short, sort of like one sentence messaging, from a candidate. What we tried to do was have, similar to the Lake Research survey that you mentioned earlier in the show, we tried to offer a little bit more, substantive sound bites from different parts of the Democratic Party coalition. And also we had one sort of like Republican soundbite just as a sort of comparison, especially to see how well progressives would do compared to a Republican among like Republican independent voters. And so we had two progressive messaging sound bites, which were a few sentences long each. One of them, they were both like sort of populist. They were both, sort of rich versus poor and the need for redistribution, but one of which used pretty simple, plain language that was phrased in terms of everyone in society. So, sort of big bread and butter issues that were of universal appeal. And the other used what we're calling, as Jen said, sort of woke rhetoric, which is just meant to be a shorthand for saying rhetoric that is more associated with sort of progressive activist rhetoric that uses words that might, apply to certain forms of oppression faced by different groups in society in a way that sounds more academic, sounds, like I said, like rhetoric that would be used more at an activist meeting rather than rhetoric that might be comprehensible to ordinary working class voters of whatever kind. And so we had the progressive that used the woke rhetoric, the progressive that used a more universal rhetoric. And then we had a parallel set of candidates that were centrist, that were not populist, were not using sort of bold redistributive language, but rather we're talking about the need to reach across the aisle. We're talking about the need to, help rely on experts to get things done, sort of like a pragmatic, more centrist approach. And then again, we had one of them used a sort of more woke style of activist rhetoric to talk about political as their political messaging. And we had the other one use sort of more universal language that didn't talk about, group specific issues, but just use more universal rhetoric. And then, like I said, we also had the Republican candidate to compare those four Democratic candidates. And what we found basically was that the two sound bites that used universal language and that used sort of plain language, either the progressive variety or the centrist variety, they consistently did better among working class respondents than did the sound bites, either the centrist or the progressive variety that employed sort of more activist, like I said, sort of academic sounding language to describe, the ills that are facing our society. And we found that not just with respect to certain parts of the working class, but across race, across different measures of the working class, like I mentioned before, the different ways you can analyze what the working class means across geography, urban, rural versus small town, rural, small town versus urban, suburban, any sort of major geographic or demographic difference that you can think of, these sort of results held where the sort of universal language, plain spoken, non-activist language, either in the progressive or in the centrist variety, performed better than their woke alternatives. And furthermore, when you combine those progressive or centrist, frankly, universalist messaging styles with progressive policies like Medicare for all, like jobs guarantee, like, ending systemic racism, those sorts of candidates that use the universal language, the non-activist language, they were much more successful among voters when they used progressive campaign issues than were candidates that use the exact same campaign issues, progressive campaign issues, but used sort of activist-inspired woke rhetoric. And like I said, we found that across all different groups. And the last thing I'd say on that is that these sort of results were most stark among, not surprisingly, at least from my vantage point, rural small town voters, among independents, among voters who lean Republican. So that is to say, the sort of people that are most likely to be swing voters in the sort of potential Democratic coalition, they were the ones who were most influenced by this sort of messaging differences. And so the takeaway being that it's most important that we sort of shy away from that kind of activist rhetoric when we're trying to reach those sorts of voters in rural small town areas, the sort of independents, the lean Republicans. That's essentially what we found.
So I want to just quickly follow up on that and maybe give some examples. I do want to say, you do provide some examples of the types of specific messages that you showed to respondents in the study. But for our purposes here on the show, like you distinguish, again, what you said was a progressive populist message, which is kind of like a Bernie Sanders style message. So like on the subject of, say, Medicare for all, that would be a message that's something like, Medicare, we need Medicare for all because Medicare for all is, because healthcare is a human right. Big pharmaceutical companies have been controlling drug prices for too long, while ordinary working people, struggle to afford insulin and are left by the wayside. This is why we need Medicare for all. Very sort of broad, Bernie style, like I said. Woke progressive, would that be something like, Medicare for all is a racial justice issue. BIPOC are, have worse health outcomes because they're discriminated against and face medical racism. I mean, I'm just like spitballing here, but can you give some
exactly
examples?
Right.
Yeah,
that's exactly right. So it's language. There's sort of two components to it, at least in the way that we thought about it, although there's additional ones that you might consider. The first one being whether or not there's sort of like buzzwords, like sort of activist-ish buzzwords, like you said, BIPOC, which is, a term that, is probably not as well known among sort of ordinary folks as it might be among activists or among academics. And sort of like transformational change or sorts of phrases that are not in common parlance, at least not among sort of working class people that I know, and that are more commonly used among activists or academics. So that's part one. And then part two is using language that's universal versus, like, that is to say, like you said, Medicare for all affects everyone. All working people should, benefit from this, will benefit from this versus, in order to solve the problems of, racial inequality or racial oppression, we need Medicare for all. So that's true. But the messaging is focused not on everyone, but on a particular kind of oppression that, isn't shared by everyone in society. So we're not at all saying that, Medicare for all wouldn't be a solution to racial justice. Obviously, it would be, but it's the messaging that's sort of focused on particular forms of oppression versus, focused on everyone in society benefiting. That's the sort of difference that we're getting at.
Right. So, sorry, one last follow-up on this messaging question. Were the differences in respondents' reactions to these two different types of messaging significant enough that it's fair to say that woke messaging is a liability? Or did there not really seem to be, how statistically significant were the differences, I guess is my question.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So there were definitely meaningful differences, and it depends on, sort of like the type of measure that we're talking about or which group and how we're tying the rhetoric to different sorts of campaign issues. But basically, if you're just looking at the messaging of, say, the woke, what we call the woke progressive, which is that sort of populist, combative, need for redistribution language, couched in sort of the activist sort of woke language, compare that at about, let me say, that was still popular among, we wanted to survey people that would potentially vote for Democrats. So we didn't actually include people that said that they were strong Republicans in our survey. We only included people that were, lean Republican or independents, because we didn't think it made sense to survey like a Democrat, like thought about progressive candidates. So because of that, even the woke progressive is a net positive type of messaging compared to the Republican, which is, you know, extremely unpopular. But but look at the differences, which is to say, among the woke progressive messaging among the entire survey of 2,000 respondents got about 52% positivity rating, whereas the populist progressive that you mentioned, the sort of universal language, not using the activist language, got around 60%. So that's an 8% difference, which is quite substantial when you think about how close elections are in US politics, right?
Yeah.
And when you do those same analyses, looking not at the entire survey, but specifically among rural small town voters, among independents, and among lean Republican voters, i.e. the swing voters that progressives need to bring into the coalition in order to expand their coalition. Well, there's other ways to do that, which we could talk about in terms of non-voters, but of current voters, the differences are even starker, right? So there is a major difference in the support that you get if you're using that sort of woke progressive language compared to the sort of populist progressive language. It's about an 8 or so point difference among all these working class voters we surveyed. And that difference is even greater if you're looking at the particular geographic areas and the particular parts of the electorate that we're trying to study, who are the swing voters that we sort of need to reach out to expand the base.
If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.